So the point of this news brief is to explain the waypoints in the war. And this is not politics. I'm not a politician. My show is not political. I am a retired military intelligence officer with a great deal of experience in special operations and covert operations. And that is where we find ourselves. Not in third generation kinetic war, but in fourth and fifth generation informational, psychological, and cyber war. The fifth generation warfare, particularly pertaining to unidentified foreign national entities, international state actors. But the waypoints are continuing. And so waypoints, or in the military, we'll call them phase lines, where we're supposed to pass a certain phase line at a certain time, are very critical. And of course, the Electoral College voting has come in, and that was a waypoint. And the propaganda press is not telling you the truth about that. They're continuing to lie. They're continuing to censor. No surprise there. But if they weren't afraid and if they weren't desperate, then they would not be censoring. So all is not lost. But I hear a lot of talk about POTUS going to enact emergency executive authorizations very shortly, especially around the December 18th date. And I do not think that is going to happen. And I will explain why. So the next, first of all, President Trump was already very accomplished, already very rich and wealthy before he ran for president. So he was not, although certainly not of sterling character, he was not really in a place to be bribed. He's actually lost money from being president. He's donated his salary, but he is trying to reestablish our constitutional republic. I think that fits well with the Q story of him being contacted by a small group of military patriots. And of course, that's been borne out with General Flynn, who's now speaking out, Chris Miller, acting DOD secretary, and Ezra Q. Watnick there for SOCOM and JSOC. But all the waypoints for legal redress of this election have not been finished yet. The next waypoint is December 23rd. December 23rd is the deadline for receipt of ballots. The electors' ballots from all states must be received by the president of the Senate by this date. And there is no penalty for missing this deadline. So that's a waypoint, but it's not a be-all, end-all waypoint. But that's the next waypoint that the President Trump and his legal team will be looking at, because before they exercise emergency military options, I am certain that he will exhaust all legal options first. Gone through several attorney generals looking for justice to be restored to the Department of Justice, gone through several intelligence heads, and it's very important for him to do that, to use the constitutional system, and also to show that it is so broken and so corrupted that there was no other opportunity except for emergency presidential action to defend the country. The next waypoint after the December 23rd deadline for receipt is the January 6th, 2021 counting of the electoral ballots. And the U.S. Congress meets in joint session to count the electoral votes. That's very key, as we're going to see, because as I was mentioning, and I'll go into more, there were GOP electoral voters who were trying to establish their count. In Michigan, they weren't allowed in, but did in other states, and that is to preserve the legal process. So this is not over. It is not over by any means. It is not legally over. And as I will get into, there are more cases in court and also heading to the Supreme Court. It's not as the propaganda press would have you believe, that it's all over. There is no office of the president-elect. It's something the left made up, and none of that has happened. And then, of course, beyond that is the January 20th, 2021 inauguration day. The president-elect becomes the president of the United States, and that waypoint is likely an end point, but not necessarily. We could be behind enemy lines by that point. But that depends upon the other two waypoints. For example, if investigations are still going on at that point, or if we are under martial law of some type by then, that endpoint is not necessarily an endpoint. And even if Biden wins, that is not the end. You can look at the British burning DC and the White House. You can look at France being occupied by the Nazis. That was not an end point. So it's really important to understand that that is not over. What's also really important to understand is that despite what the propaganda press has said, that there could not be a coronavirus vaccine before the end of the year, it has indeed happened. And so that is another place where the propaganda press had tried to fact check and said it's not possible, it can't happen, and there are several variations. Now, I'm very well aware of all the concerns, and I thank everyone for their information and reports that they're sending me on all of that. And I work in biotech competitive intelligence, so I'm very familiar with the issues and the RNA and the problems and anomalies with the vaccines. But the most important thing to understand first is that it was a bioweapon that was released by China. I've done lots of deep dives on that, and that violates many international treaties, and that goes along with unrestricted warfare. But it's important to realize what was the purpose of it. And I've said this many times too, and that is it was for economic battle. Economic battle in China's doctrine of unrestricted warfare. And how was it primarily used? It was primarily used as a psychological operation. And the mask wearing is primarily a psychological operation vector. It's a way to see how effective your PSYOP is. So in the first Gulf War, when Fourth PSYOP group, part of SOCOM, dropped leaflets to the Iraqis and said, come out with your weapon, your hands over your heads, your weapons over your heads. We won't bury you alive. We'll feed you, take care of you. And thousands did that. When they came out with their hands over their heads with their weapons held over their heads, then we could have a metric for the effectiveness of the vector that we used, which was leaflets, which was an airborne PSYOP operation. The COVID-19 is the same thing. It is not very lethal. There's a half a dozen other things that kill more Americans annually than COVID-19. The infection fatality rate rate of death is at 78, which is at the time where most Americans die anyway. The transmission rate from child to adult is nil. So there's no real reason to keep schools closed. There's no real reason for distancing. Of course, we saw one of the reasons. At first, we thought it was just for economic battle, that is, to stop the U.S. economy after Trump had leveraged a new economic agreement with China after beginning to open up North Korea. And I compare that to Roosevelt blockading Japan. And so China had to react quickly. It had to activate all of its paid off traders through their spy networks and create economic battle through the bioweapon COVID-19 for their doctrine of unrestricted warfare. It worked too well. It stopped the world economy and made China a pariah. China doesn't have enough rice now. China has all kinds of floods happening. The Communist Party is in disarray. The Communist Party list has been so-called leaked. That is another part of cyber warfare, just like the 3 hard drives of Hunter coming out to a blind computer repairman so that he couldn't be charged with the felonies under 18, I think it is, 249 for reviewing Joe Biden's, or rather Hunter Biden's Asian child crime. So the fact that the vaccine is coming out and that the military is helping get it out, 16 to 18 locations nationwide and 3 locations overseas through active duty and through the National Guard, shows that the American military is federalized and pre-deployed. And part of that is what we've seen with all of the naval activities off both coasts, all the C-130s at Nellis moving around. But the point is, the military is deployed and the National Guard is deployed. But it's not primarily to worry about a bioweapon, that there has always been a good combination, hydrochloroquine, azithromycin, and zinc, and a couple other things, according to your doctor, and other things that I will be talking about as alternatives to the vaccine. And the vaccine is voluntary, even for the military. That's not the point. The point is that Trump has deployed the military nationally and OCONUS in support of the vaccine. So what's the least corrupt part of our corrupted and infiltrated government? It's not federal law enforcement. It's not the intelligence community. It's the military. And really the DIA follows under the military. So the way to look at this is a counter to COVID-19. But what is primarily COVID-19? Primarily, it was a PSYOP operation. This is a counter PSYOP operation. If the vaccine is going to be out there in tens of millions of dosages, then why do we still need to be shut down? We don't. Why do we then need to be wearing masks? Biden says he's going to instigate 100 days of mask wearing. Why do we need that? We don't. Why can't we gather and exercise our First Amendment rights? We can. There's no reason for it any longer, because the vaccines, the various vaccines, remdesivir, Pfizer, various types, and all kinds of other antidotes and solutions of prophylactics are out there. So then why do election officials have to distance? They don't. This is a strategic move to counter a bioweapon that was primarily for economic battle, used for a psychological operations vector. That's why the vaccine is important. And that's why it's voluntary for the military. But the other important strategic informational warfare of that is that everybody, including NPR, CBS, all of them said Trump is contradicting the CDC. There can't be a vaccine ready by the end of the year. It can't happen. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And again, they were wrong. The real question is, when is the last time they were right about anything? The real question is, when was the last time Schiff, Comey, Brennan, the left were right about anything and we're not lying? So that is crucial. And where are the highest rates of COVID infection? They're in left-wing states. They tried to place it like it was Arizona. Arizona wasn't even on the top 20 of the list at the time. It was New York, and it was done by Cuomo by locking up elderly. And there's lots of accusations, rightly so, that he killed a lot of elderly people by admitting COVID positive back into nursing homes. So then where will the federal assets and the National Guard and the military be deployed? Well, it will be deployed in those feral cities. Feral cities is the term that SOCOM used to defeat ISIS when Trump unleashed SOCOM and JSOC to finish off ISIS. And of course, it is also in these battleground states. This is not a coincidence. This is part of a covert World War IV strategy, countering PSYOP, countering economic battle in unrestricted warfare. So even though the propaganda press keeps telling everyone that the AP has called the election for Biden, there are now mountains of evidence of systemic election fraud, sent alternate slates of electors who cast their ballots for President Trump in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. All of these sent alternate slates of electors to cast their electoral votes for President Trump. These cast electoral votes are now available on January 6th, when Congress convenes to count the electoral votes in case President Trump succeeds in the SCOTUS or in state legislatures, resulting in dueling slates of electors. So these electoral votes act like placeholders to keep Trump's options open while the lawsuits continue to work their way to SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States. And in case he invokes Executive Order 13848 on foreign interference in U.S. elections, which by now any reasonable person would say he could enact. But he's not going to enact that until he's exhausted all legal courses, all legal options. That will be, as I used to have the music from it when I was on a radio station, that will be the final option, I believe. And that will help justify his actions as well, that he had exhausted all other legal options through the Department of Justice, through the Attorney General, the video evidence against the Clintons, against the Bidens. And Barr has covered all that up. And there's plenty of whistleblowers coming forward to talk about that. So this is historic and unparalleled that Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico all had GOP electors cast votes for President Trump. And that preserves POTUS's remedy of fraud with these electors. As far as I know, this has never happened before. It is going to be very difficult for the Congress and the Supreme Court to ignore this. So this is why these next waypoints are very crucial. Of course, we are running out of legal waypoints. We haven't even gotten to the military waypoints and the executive order waypoints. But the vote of Electoral College is not certified until Congress certifies it. Legally, no one is president-elect until Congress certifies a majority of the Electoral College for that person. So for Pennsylvania, the GOP had 20 electors. For Georgia, 16 electors. For Michigan, 16 electors. For Wisconsin, 10 electors. For Arizona, 11 electors. For Nevada, 6 electors. For New Mexico, 5 electors. That's 84 electoral votes that are in dispute. It's not one state. It is a number of states, and it's all the battleground states. And that combined with the evidence is still substantial and still very important. So here in Arizona, Dr. Kelly Ward, who I have known, and I haven't spoken to her for a while, but she said that yesterday 22 legislatures and 8 legislatures-elect signed a joint resolution calling on Congress to accept the alternative state of electors and abstain from accepting the Biden electoral votes until the investigations are completed. And that's why the final endpoint of inauguration could change to a waypoint, depending upon how that plays out. And that is not all. There is an obscure Section 15 of Electoral Count Act of 1887. And Section 15 of the Electoral Count Act of 1887, in one reading, Congress would count electoral slates backed by state governors. In another reading, the state's electoral votes would not be counted at all. That would be an alternative that the state governors would make the difference. Now, that is obscure. There's a lot of legal dispute over that, but that is not any different than Biden sitting in Obama's office, and we have Brennan's handwritten note saying, well, let's use the Logan Act to go after Flynn. So this, again, is a counter. They used, I just did a show called The War of Law, and this would be a counter to that war of law that was used there. So there is quite a bit of possibility and potentiality given what is happening, because every day more fraud arises and more evidence arises. And it is not a coincidence that the Communist Chinese Party list was so-called leaked. It was not leaked. That's a counter of cyber warfare happening. So that depends upon precedent and how the Section 15 of the Electoral Count Act of 1887 is interpreted. But by one reading of the law, Biden could be deprived of 270 because the electors cannot be seated. Then it goes to the House, where the GOP has 26 delegations. They cast their votes for Trump. That would be another way for Trump to win. 26 versus is just over the majority of 50 states. So the other alternative is, and that now we're going to, from the continuing legal arguments, which I think that Trump will exhaust all of those avenues first. But if there are continued cyber and informational attacks happening, if we are declared into a covert war, and again, the Director of National Intelligence has said this, but not Chris Miller has not said this, then, of course, the sitting commander-in-chief, the President of the United States, Trump, would continue in the middle of the crisis. There would not be a handoff, because this is all about espionage and cybertage. Again, not plays on words, but trying to explain blendings of new types of third and fourth generation unrestricted warfare. So I hope that makes sense. And I hope you are following with that. If you're not, then you can always go to patreon.com, Jeffrey Prather, and I have downloaded a ton of stuff. I didn't get to download the entire Chinese Communist list, and I'm looking to cross that from Chinese styled English and American names because it was so big, but some of that is up there. I saw a little bit of comments before the show about China and Canada. I do have solid intelligence that Canada has been allowing China to train in Canada. I haven't posted that because there are classification concerns, but that has been confirmed to my satisfaction. So let's go back to enemy intent. What is the enemy's goal here? And there are many enemies. There are domestic traitors, and there are foreign enemies. But generally speaking, the foreign enemies support the domestic traitors. That's with Christine Fang sleeping around with Swalwell and Ohio mayors and everywhere. Now there's pictures of her showing up everywhere as a Chinese sparrow. And counterfeit monies and weapons coming into the battleground states. But what is the goal? Because I still keep getting emails about Chinese troops invading and 50,000 Chinese troops killed or some such nonsense. That is not the case. The logistics signature for JATMs, giant bombs, and killing 50,000 troops would be very difficult to cover up. As young intelligence officer sent me, that was earthquakes recorded. And again, Chinese troops invading or UN troops invading would go against the Chinese enemy doctrine of unrestricted warfare. It would go back to third generational warfare. And the whole point of the unrestricted generation warfare doctrine was that we cannot beat the Americans head on. The Chinese have finally learned the lessons that the Nazis, the Imperial Japanese, could not learn, that ISIS could not learn. That mistake made the mistake of thinking that because most of the time we're fun, loving, and happy, that we aren't the greatest warriors the world has ever seen. And that mistake is always fatal. So then what is the goal? Unrestricted warfare goal can be found out in some points made by Di Dongsheng, Vice Dean of the School of International Relations, Renmin University of China, Vice Director and Secretary of the Center for Foreign Strategic Studies of China, on November 28th in Shanghai, China. And the theme of the event was, will China's opening up of its financial sector attract Wall Street wolf? And that's what they want to happen.